Threats, predators, and violent pornographic content lurk behind our children's screens. How can we protect their eyes? This week, Rania sits down with Chris McKenna, who has also been seen in the social media documentary Childhood 2.0. He's the founder and CEO of Protect Young Eyes, an organization on a mission to create safer digital spaces in partnership with parents and community members.
And there's all kinds of opinions out there about the whistleblower and the testimony. What was her real motivation? There are elements of truth in what she was saying, regardless of what her motives are. There are elements of truth that parents should pay attention to when it comes to what happens when you drop a bunch of teenagers with brains that are not fully developed into godlike technologies that are motivated to engage us at all costs. There's bound to be some impacts there that I think we should be paying attention to.
In their powerful sit-down, Chris and Rania tackle online threats, pornography exposures, predators, and their take on the Facebook whistleblower. This episode is a must-see for all parents navigating the tech world, so let's jump right in. Without further ado, here's your host, Rania Mankarious.
Welcome to the Balanced Voice podcast. I'm so excited for today's guest, Chris McKenna. We've been working on having him on the podcast since last year. Chris, first of all, welcome.
Thank you so much. I know the years with the pandemic, it all kind of blends together. It seems just like yesterday, but I'm so glad this worked out.
I'm so glad. So let me just share a little bit about Chris. Okay. He is the digital marketing manager for Covenant Eyes, but he's also the creator and founder of Protect Young Eyes, which is an unbelievable organization doing incredible things. By the end of this podcast, if you're not already following him and actively engaged with the content he's putting out, I'm urging you, if not begging you, to do so. In 2019, he testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. He was a catalyst for draft legislation and ongoing discussion that could radically change the online child protection laws for children. In 2020, he was featured in the film Childhood 2.0. Chris, you have an incredible heart and an incredible message to protect kids online. I just want to start by asking you, how did you fall into this, or why did you develop a passion for this?
Oh yeah, fall into it. That's a great verb to describe. This was never my intent. I'm a CPA, Rania. I mean, that's my background, right? I was a consultant for Ernst & Young for 12 years. The Lord called me into full-time ministry back in 2009. And so I then had both a financial role, but also a student ministry role. Not that those things really are that compatible, but I had right brain going towards students and left brain going towards church finance. And from 2009 to 2016, which was when I was in my middle school ministry role, that was the rise of portable internet, right? That's the rise of iPhones and social media and parents coming to me saying, Chris, what's this new app called Snapchat? And I have a consulting background, so I fix problems. That's what I like to do. I see a problem and I try to come up with a solution to fix it. And about that same time, there was a Wednesday night opening where no teaching was planned, and church leadership came to me and said, what would you like to put in this space? And I said, you know what? Nobody is talking about online pornography. This is back in 2014. No one was talking about this at the time. I said, I want to talk to the congregation about the online porn that I'm seeing in social media spaces like Instagram. And so they let me do a presentation, and all these things started kind of happening at the same time. And so I created a closed Facebook group called Digital Kids that led to, well, that's not a great name. So then we changed it to Protect Young Eyes. There was a news story that was done. I started the website in 2015, and it all just sort of grew out of that. So it was, right? I mean, the Lord's hand was in that, but it was see a problem, fix a problem, and it hasn't gone away. But we were one of those early voices saying, wait a minute, we're putting kids in all these digital spaces. Have you actually seen what's in these digital spaces? This isn't good for them. And we were one of those first voices saying, hey, I know the App Store says that the rating is 12 plus.
Yeah.
But is this what you want to show a 12-year-old? And we were saying 15, if not older than that. And now everybody's saying that. And we're happy that everybody's saying that. So that's how we got started.
And it's such an important thing that you're doing. You know, we look now, 2021, the online world that kids are being raised in, the things that they're exposed to. I pulled a quote from you from Childhood 2.0, and I loved it. You said, we're trading the false sense of safety and security for actually putting our kids in riskier situations. And I think a lot of parents hear and know the online world is bad. The online world can expose your children to a lot of things. But at the end of the day, we still think, I hear it, but it's not my kid. They're in a great school. We live in a great neighborhood. We invest so much in their upbringing. And there's this disconnect. And I talk about this disconnect a lot. We've had Tanya on from Bark. We've had Dr. Laura Berman on the podcast. We've talked to a lot of people about this inherent disconnect between the reality of the online world and who our kids are and what they might actually see. But I mean, you see this amongst, I hate the term, but good kids, everyday kids, to struggling kids. You're seeing the exposure and the impact of that in real time.
Definitely. And that disconnect is something that all of us, I'm so glad you've talked to Dr. Laura and to Tanya, friends. They're amazing, amazing people. I think the disconnect, one of the reasons, there's many, but I think one of the reasons is that the impacts are a lot less measurable and a lot less visible, right? It's easy to see we have a teenage pregnancy problem if young girls are pregnant. It's easy to see that we have a teenage drug problem if kids are addicted to drugs. The impacts today are less obvious and less measurable. Therefore, they create less urgency in us as parents. So to say to a family or a good family, right, there is a chance that your teenage son or daughter, by spending time in Instagram, could develop unhealthy behaviors in Instagram, or if struggling with self-harm or whatever self-image, that Instagram's algorithm could accelerate those sort of negative feelings or negative outcomes in your child. That's a lot less measurable. There's a lot of variables and sort of neurological things that we're talking about that are a lot less obvious than some of the other issues that Gen Xers were concerned with when we were growing up, right? So we look at the stats, all the things that we used to measure. Teen pregnancy is like bottoming out, right? Teen drug use is down in some ways, but we've traded that for, the email that I got today, Chris, help me. I have a 5th grader who's addicted to porn. Chris, help me. My 13-year-old son found something and now is addicted to porn. We've traded some of these other problems that we grew up with for other things. And I think that's some of the disconnect that parents, and not to mention just sort of a general apathy. They use it too, right? It's hard for me to have strong opinions about you being on your phone when I, as an adult, I'm kind of addicted to it too. There's just a lot of complicated reasons for that disconnect. But more and more, I'm just of the opinion that the period of parental ignorance around these topics is kind of coming to a close. I was okay with a bunch of parents saying to me, I didn't know. And there's all kinds of opinions out there about the whistleblower and the testimony. What was her real motivation? There are elements of truth in what she was saying, regardless of what her motives are. There are elements of truth that parents should pay attention to when it comes to what happens when you drop a bunch of teenagers with brains that are not fully developed into godlike technologies that are motivated to engage us at all costs. There's bound to be some impacts there that I think we should be paying attention to.
I love how you just summarized that. And I want to talk about the Facebook whistleblower in a second, but I also want to share, I have three young girls, and I've have this conversation about online usage and social media with them from a very young age, before they even had phones. Now, I'm one of the parents that wants my kids to be able to connect with me. There are a lot of people that come to me and say, well, I refuse to give my child a phone until they're driving. And I'll say, well, I think my child needs to be able to connect with me at a younger age. And there's ways to allow them. You can get a Gab phone, a Gizmo watch. You can do a lot of things that allow your child to stay connected to you. And then at some point, they may need a phone, but it's figuring out how to manage the online world and access that phone gives them during a time of such extreme development, puberty, the brain, physiological, psychological, mental well-being, all of it is like peaking and ebbing and flowing and coming up and crushing down.
Right.
And you're giving them this access. So when my kids look at me and they say, but mom, you're always on your phone. I say, but that's true. I use my phone. I'm probably addicted to my phone. And I say it and I talk about it, but I'm also not struggling with the same things that they're struggling with. And I'm also not pulled. I'm not tempted to do a challenge that pops up on TikTok. I have no desire to trend on Twitter. Zero. It's different for our kids, even kids raised in a wonderful environment, in a great school, in a great home, because the online world is so much more powerful than I think we realize.
Definitely. And it's really powerful that you've had those conversations long before they are actually acquiring these devices, right? So some of that's just sort of embedded in your daughters, which is great. Another element that what you said, you touched on the neurology. And I think as parents, if we understand adolescent neurology, it so increases our ability to understand why kids do the things that they do online, why online spaces can be risky for kids. And third, when kids make bad choices online, to have greater empathy for that. Why? Because the adolescent brain is all go and no slow. They don't have the same braking system that our more developed brain does. Therefore, when I see a teenager addicted to TikTok, what I say to myself is that is a perfectly predictable outcome for a perfectly tuned algorithm. This is not a teen problem. I would hope that parents would put less kids in TikTok to start. I'm not totally absolving families of responsibility here, but I want us to understand as families that kids addicted to their devices is a perfectly predictable outcome from this. That's exactly what they are engineered to do. And with brains that don't have any of the executive functioning that we do, yes, many kids addicted to their phones is exactly what I would expect.
You have another quote that I loved. You said, what they see, they feel neurologically compelled to do. I mean, that's not a lot of words, but a jam-packed statement. They feel neurologically compelled to do. You're seeing that in working with children.
That was a quote, particularly in the segment of Childhood 2.0 related to pornography. And I was connecting it to early childhood exposure to pornography, Rania, because I think that the earlier the exposure, the greater the risk that a child is going to act out what they see, right? So young children have different brains. They soak things up differently than we do. They're spongier than we do as adults. We're a little crustier, a little more plastic, or I guess a little more ceramic in our thinking. They're a little more plastic and flexible, but they have specific types of neurons, mirror neurons, that give them this uncanny ability to mimic the things that they see. That's why they even are unsavory behaviors. They copy us sometimes, right? And so as you talk to those who work with young offenders, okay, so there are children's assessment center-like organizations all over the country doing unbelievably good, necessary, and crushingly heartbreaking work, right, with young offenders. And when you talk to them, as I have here in Grand Rapids, the number one common trait that young people who abuse other children sexually, the number one thing they have in common is an early childhood exposure to pornography. In other words, what a child sees, he or she is often neurologically compelled to do. Good and bad kids, right? This is not a good kid and bad kid thing. This is a kid with a brain thing. And if I see porn, it creates this toxic curiosity inside of young brains. I know because I was exposed to porn at age 8. I know what that did to me. And that's what I meant by that phrase, is connected to porn. That is a risk that we have to be aware of. This is why when parents are like, well, my kid is going to spend time in another person's house, do I ask them about their tech? And I'm like, yes. Any home that your child is going to spend time in, you need, I would think, to have knowledge about, do they have a router? Is there unmonitored access to an iPhone or an iPad? All it takes is one exposure to radically change the trajectory of a young life. It's the same thing, my parents just kind of needed to know, did the house have Showtime, Cinemax, or HBO? Like that was the extent of childhood damage that could be done to me. Maybe MTV, I don't know, but that's the MTV discussion for today. And I think we have every right to lovingly but directly ask that question, where my kid is spending time.
And we're dealing with a different beast because, let's say you and I are of the same generation. Those were the few questions, but even those shows, I think probably were a bit more careful about what they expose children to. And then the other question would be, for a girl going to, do they have brothers? What type of magazine subscriptions do they have? What type of content might be laying around the house? And that was it. But now you're being fed, you're being forced to see very live content that's continual, that's changing, that's getting more aggressive, that's being force fed to you. And I think the Facebook whistleblower, and I know there's been a lot of discussion, which I find so interesting, about what her motives are. And I'm with you. I don't know that I care one way or the other about her motives, but I do care about what she talked about. Because for me, it makes you feel like, how do we, as regular moms, regular dads, regular 8-year-olds to 25-year-olds, fight these tech giants? There's almost no way to do it. I mean, you're doing it. You're on the front lines. We're pushing, their families pushing for legislation. But some of the main points, and I took this from Bark. Bark listed some of the main points from the Facebook whistleblower. They intentionally target children under 13. Mind you, you have to be 13 to be on the platform, but they're intentionally targeting children younger than that. The algorithms encourage hate speech. They approve ads encouraging teen drug use. They encourage eating disorders in young girls. They know that Instagram increases suicidal ideation. They know that Instagram, for example, is not protecting kids. How does the average person, knowing that they can't keep their children away from technology in full, how do you protect your child from what is going on?
Well, for those who have not given their children access to all these spaces yet, the number one thing that we would say on the preventative side is that delay is the way. Delay is the way. I've never had a parent come to me and say, I gave my kid social media too late.
Yeah.
Nobody has ever said, you know what? I waited too long to give my kid an iPhone. I really regret that decision. Rania, we've done 1,300 presentations over the past 6 years. No one has ever said those two things to me.
But Chris, what about the parent that says the only way my daughter's friend interact is that's how they interact with each other?
It is.
Socially.
This is difficult. And I hear that and I'm understanding to that. And so to me, everything is a risk balance. That probably comes from my time at Ernst & Young, right? I always look at situations, whether professionally or personally, as trying to mitigate risk to an appropriate low level. And I think that the same is true with our young people. There's my hope, if you're going to give that 13-year-old an iPhone and give him or her access to Instagram, my hope is that there are certain things that have taken place that would mitigate that risk to a spot where you feel more comfortable about it. Meaning, maybe for 3 or 4 years, you've been doing technology with this son or daughter. You have an idea as to how he or she interacts with technology, what his or her tendencies are. You've been talking about pornography for years, and he or she knows exactly what to do, that it's a normal word to say, that I can talk to mom or dad anytime I want about it. These are things that create a foundation of digital trust, which is a big deal to us. We talk a lot at Protect Young Eyes about the digital trust framework. These are attributes of families who tend to have kids who use technology in a good and positive way, do certain things. And these are things that I would say to a mom or dad who asked me that exact same question. You know what? And this came up often during lockdown pandemic times, because that was the only way that kids could interact with each other. And I very much understood that, but I just wanted that choice to be wrapped around a lot of other risk mitigating sort of steps, that devices aren't in the bedroom, that we have the right conversations, that they're put in a certain place at night, that there's an openness about tech, that there's some sort of tech agreement that isn't just what mom or dad want, but they've invited the child in to say, what are our co-developed ideas I have concerns about giving you Instagram, but I know that's how you talk to your friends. Help me not worry about that. What are your ideas for helping me not to worry about that? And do that together. Give a kid agency in that decision. So those are things that I would wrap all around that as ways to say to myself that I could go to bed at night as a good, loving dad and say, you know what? I had to give my 14-year-old son Instagram today. But these are the things that give me some comfort that I've mitigated that risk to a spot. I'm not going to ignore it. I'm going to keep talking to him about it, but I feel better about that decision because of these things. In other words, we don't just drop them in the deep end of the pool. I want that wrapped around all kinds of other things that have hopefully happened to prepare that younger than I want child for that digital environment.
And I'll add to that. One of the things we talk about is, we realize there are certain situations our kids, as they grow, will want to be a part of. I use a very simple example of Halloween, for example, which is coming up. People will say, what age can my kids go trick-or-treating alone? And I say, well, I've sort of this golden rule. You have to have a conversation with a child who wants to go out alone. Okay, what time of the night are you going? Who are you going with? What path are you taking? What happens if you're asked to go off the beaten path? What happens if somebody approaches you that makes you feel uncomfortable, or you find yourself in a situation that's uncomfortable, or somebody gets hurt? And as you're talking to a child about this, if the child can answer you and go through the conversation and think and give and take and say, I didn't think of that, but what would I do? Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I think your child is demonstrating that they're mature enough to handle going trick-or-treating alone. You'll have other kids that will say, oh my God, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to go off the beaten path. Well, they'll just say, no, I don't want to talk. That's scary. I don't want to. Well, that's an indication that your child is not mature enough to handle the situation.
Right.
So I always tell people before you give a cell phone or give them access, because there's some slight differentiation, but before you give them access, have those conversations. Use the words, as you're saying, talk about pornography, talk about the requests they're going to get, talk about all the content they're going to see. And if you find them shocked and terrified, unable to talk it through with you, I think they're kind of telling you they're not ready. Now, your site talks about at-home assessments. What are those?
Yeah. So one of the presentations that we do in sort of a larger question of how do I protect my kid in general, not just on Instagram or just in a specific application or space, but we teach 4 layers of digital protection when it comes to homes. And those start at the relational and then they move toward technical layers, because I think we have to lead with relational first. May there never be a toggle that replaces our digital parenting, right? And whenever possible, I want to try to solve technical issues with relational solutions, because they're always going to find a way to beat the toggle. They're going to find a way to, circumvent the parental controls. And so you fill those gaps with the relationship, the open and honest conversations, that if you're going to use something like Covenant Eyes or Bark or whatever it might be, you look your young child, your child in the eye and say, you know what? I bet if you went to TikTok or you went to YouTube that you could find videos that kids are going to put together to teach you how to get around some of the stuff that I've put in place. I've seen them already myself. But here's what's going to happen. 1, I don't want you to look that stuff up. I'm trusting you with this device. Meet me halfway here. Number 2, if I find out that you have done some of those things, there are going to be consequences. I don't want that. And I know that you don't either. So let's just agree that this is what mom or dad needs to do to kind of sleep at night. Why? Because I love you to death. And I'd be a horrible parent if I didn't do a few things to prove that I kind of love you in this internet thing. So just meet me halfway and agree that you're not going to do that stuff. And if that happens, kumbaya, we're all good here. And I just think call out all the stuff that we are afraid of. Let them hear it, let them know it, put it out in the light where I think it automatically has a whole lot less temptation and just chat openly about it. And I think that creates that digital trust that I really want when it comes to some of these spaces. That's what I mean by sort of looking for relational solutions to technical problems. So that first layer is the digital trust framework. We explain that in great detail. That's layer one. Layer two is then the locational. So there's relational, then the locational layer. There are just certain places that whether you're 14 or 40, you probably shouldn't be online. So during the pandemic, we talked about the toxic trio. Again, whether you're a teen or an adult, if you're online in your bedroom at night and you're bored, that's the toxic trio: bedroom, darkness, and boredom. Whether you're 14 or 40, eventually you do something stupid online. So let's avoid some of those locational temptations too, both as adults and as kids. And that by doing it too, that gets back to digital trust, because if they see us doing it, instead of being hypocritical about rules for them that don't apply to us, then I think they're bound to obey all of the rules that we put in place related to technology. And then we get into the technical layers of the router is the most important digital device in any house, and nobody ever pays attention to it. Yeah, but think about how many things in a typical American home are connected to the Wi-Fi in your house. Mm-hmm. So get that router layer right. That's number 3. We recommend Griffin, which is an awesome product. I use it in my house. I got one sitting on my desk here, a new one. And then the 4th layer is then at the device, because it's not always attached to your home network. That's where Covenant Eyes on the device, so that it goes with it, with its data plan, wherever it goes. That's where Bark on a device goes with it. So those are the 4 layers. So we have an assessment right there on the website that someone just pops in their email address. They'll get a 10-question sort of assessment that'll lead them through to find some of those weak spots, and then links to our website to help fill those spots so that they can get those layers in place.
It's so great. Chris, as you deal with families and talk to kids, and I mean, are there any situations, or is there a point where you say, this child, this phone or gadget must be removed? Is it the point of pornography addiction, suicidal ideation, self-harm? I mean, how do you handle crises and trauma when you're dealing with these kids, especially when there's such a nexus to online interaction?
Yeah. Every situation in family is a little bit different. Taking devices away, I think, should be one of the last things that we do, because sometimes that in itself can cause trauma. Think of the path here, right? We've given them the device. We've also let them use social media. And no matter what the kid, there is an element of every teenage brain that gets a little bit hooked on those apps. Then they do something wrong in those apps, and we rip it out of their hands. We're creating this dopamine gap inside of them that really is our fault. So they're going to go search for ways to fill that in maybe other ways. Whenever possible, I don't want that to be the outcome. But for horrible, situations, kids that are, made some really bad, are into really just horrible types of pornography, whatever it is, then yes, absolutely. But it's done with an abundance of grace and care instead of condemnation and discipline, right? If a kid has discovered that he or she, because this is very much a teen girl problem too, I want everybody to hear that. But if a teenager is caught, in this addiction, this issue of pornography, they already know that it's wrong. And so I want our first response to be, oh my gosh, I am so glad that we're talking about this. I am so glad that we can now do this. There's nothing wrong with you. I love you. There's nothing you could do, nothing you can look at online that is ever going to change our relationship. So maybe the first thing that everybody who might watch or listen to this needs to do, if you're a parent or a caring adult who has young people, is go find a mirror. Imagine every horrible thing that could happen to the children that you love online. And then immediately after, say to yourself, I'm not going to freak out. 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 I want our first reaction to be of acceptance, of I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere, so that they know that we are not the ones that are keeping that shame cycle going, because all that does is chase them into more and more problems.
And that is such a huge statement, because as we follow stories of kids, particularly who have committed suicide, a lot of them have committed suicide because they've ended up sending a picture to somebody, they thought it was one person, it ended up being a different person, or it was who they intended it to, but it was shared, or that picture was used against them. We're going to send this to your family, your friends. You want your child to think, first of all, of course, you want your child to never choose to do that. But should they, you want them to know that there's nothing that you could do. There's nothing that someone could send me about you that would make me love you less, feel embarrassed that you're my child, think anything less of you. We would get through it together. I don't think enough parents do what you just said and say those things to our children because we kind of don't want to go there.
And I would say
we don't want to go there.
We don't. And so let's say those things before it happens.
Yes.
Let them know long before. The moment we give them a digital device, I want you to look at them and say, it could be that you make a choice on this that changes the direction of your life, or that somebody sends you, or something could happen on this supercomputer that I am placing in your hands that is wrong, horrible, or hurts you. And I want you to know that no matter what that is, I'm safe. As my good friend who almost 1 year ago, Colin Karchner, passed away, who I'm sure many who will watch or listen to this know Colin because he left a big footprint. He used to say that he and Lizzie were the no trouble bubble, right? That's such a good sticky phrase. And I want us to look at all of our kids and tell them that. Not just convincing, we say that not just so that they know, we say that so that we believe it when we say it. And I think, to your point, we need to believe it so that our first reaction is of, I'm so glad you told me, and not, how could you have done that? And there's a radical difference, even in your face, between those two postures.
So important. And Colin, we followed him for a long time. He was actually scheduled to be on the podcast, and that didn't end up happening. So many are doing such great work. We love what you're doing, Chris. Before we have to let you go, and I don't want to let you go because I could literally talk to you all day. I want to know more just quickly. In 2019, again, you did testify before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. What were you testifying for or against? And what is your feeling about where we're going legislatively when it comes to monitoring or holding even these tech giants accountable?
Yeah, so the push behind the 2019 hearing, and that was really the first of these hearings. If you go back since that hearing, July of 2019, we've had a number of them since. So that sort of started the ball on, hey, we need to think about updating our legislation. It's almost unbelievable. But in the United States, the last law that was passed that protects kids online in any significant way is COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act, from the year 2000, 3 years before MySpace was released.
It's crazy.
It does not protect kids. We're like the laughing stock of the civilized world when you look at what other countries are doing, Australia, the UK, and others.
Sorry, but just to summarize, that goes to the protection of a minor's information online. That's all right. that goes to.
That's all that it does. It's a privacy-focused act, which says that in order to collect personally identifiable information, somebody has to be at least 13. So that's all that did. What the hearing, the conversation at the hearing started back in 2019 was focused on two main areas. Number one, that the App Store is broken. Both of the app stores, the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store, are inaccurate and have no accountability when it comes to what they say about the apps. Therefore, from an education perspective, the doorway through which parents are trying to make decisions does not adequately inform them as to the risks that exist in those apps. So we started the Fix App Ratings movement sort of as a part of that. And we're super stoked that today, almost 2.5 years later, there is legislation being introduced today. And I know people are going to be listening to this at all different times. So this is October 15th here, 2021, in the House of Representatives related to the fixing the app ratings process. We're super excited about that. The other part of it was this idea of defaults. The first question that Senator Ernst from Iowa asked me was, okay, Chris, talk to me about the devices. What could we do? And my response was almost every digital device, be it an Android or an iPhone, knows the age of its user. Why don't these devices by default have certain protections in place? Why is it that we have to hunt for protection? That the default posture of our digital devices, even when it knows that it's being used by a 12-year-old, is exploitation instead of protection? As a parent, I have to search for protection. That's not the way it is in all of the physical places. If I take my kid to a playground, I don't have to search for a safe place. It's built for them from the beginning as a place for kids to play. If I want to make it dangerous, that's the effort I have to put in. And it's not that way in digital spaces. We treat it exactly the opposite. So those were the two main themes. And we're starting to see some traction, as I just said, in both of those. It just takes time. It's difficult when those that are making the laws, they're so far generationally removed from these technologies that we're talking about. So there's so much education that goes into them even understanding, both their staff and them, what the true risk is to the American population so that they can then be motivated to make change.
Chris, you're so good. You're so good. I could talk to you for the next 2 weeks without stopping. How do people follow you and stay engaged with what you're doing and support the work that you're doing?
Thank you. You're so kind. We send out a regular email newsletter. If anybody who hears or watches this just simply wants to text the word protect to the number 66866 from any phone in the United States, you'll then be a part of our newsletter. We have a website that stays up to date on different research. For example, we just did a post all about Squid Games, which is all the rage on Netflix right now. That's on our blog. But as you and I made the connection through social media, we also, even though I can't stand their business model and some of the choices they make, I'm going to leverage it for as much good as possible. And we're very active. Just search in Facebook or Instagram for Protect Young Eyes and follow us there. All of those things I just listed for parents, friends, that's all free. We have some paid content, but those three things I just listed, our website, obviously what we do on social and responding to people there, and that newsletter, that's free. In other words, please use it.
And it's a wealth of information, and you will never regret going and learning more about how to keep your kids safe online. Chris McKenna, thank you so much for being with us on the Balanced Voice podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. And we'll catch you next time. Take care, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to today's Balanced Conversation. You can find real solutions and tangible resources in our show notes at thebalancedvoicepodcast.com. To join the conversation, follow us on Instagram at The Balanced Voice Podcast and on Twitter at @BalancedVoice_. Stay up to date on Rania's work by following her at The Rania Report, and we can't wait to see you next week for another Balanced Conversation.